Hello, fellow birders. My name is Denis Kania. Today we're going to be talking about 3 things you can do in your backyard that will help birds. On the DuPage Birding Club education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird related. And as I mentioned, today we'll be talking about 3 things you can do in your backyard that will help birds. You want to see these kinds of birds lurking around in your backyard. There's lots of things you can do to attract them. Food, water, and shelter are the things that probably exist in most of our backyards, and it's something that all living things need. So we can take steps to improve our backyards and provide features that will benefit more species. Diversity is the key, along with understanding the basic needs of birds. So we can go ahead and we can add a bird house or a bird feeder or a bird bath, but it's not entirely that simple because there are other needs for birds. Here's some examples of some of the common birds I expect to see in my backyard, and they regularly occur, and I don't have to do a whole lot to attract them. So I have a bunch pictured here, and then there's a few others named below. But altogether, it's roughly 22 species of birds I can expect in my backyard. But there's a lot more birds than that coming through DuPage County. In fact, there's 268 species that regularly occur in the county. So that 22 species that show up in my backyard only represent about 8% of all of the possible birds. And of course, there's some birds that are never going to show up in someone's backyard. Things like shorebirds or waterfowl, unless you have a very unique situation in your yard, you're not going to see things like that. So right off the bat, we're not going to expect to see about 45% of the birds that show up in the county. That still leaves 125 species, or 47%, that you might be able to attract to your yard if you provide the right resources. Very few of these are actually resident species, so we would expect to see them during migration or maybe as winter visitors. And these are the times when birds are going to need our help the most. So it really pays to make some changes to our backyards. So let's talk about providing that shelter for starters. So of those common species, 8 out of the 22 are cavity nesters. So putting up a birdhouse actually does help. It will satisfy the needs of a third of those common species. But then there's another 7 that are just very generalists as far as nesting sites. And so just about anything will satisfy them. And we do have one species that doesn't even build a nest. But if we increase the habitat diversity in our backyards, we can actually capture those 6 remaining species that could nest in an average backyard. But shelter is more than a nesting site. When we think about a birdhouse, we kind of equate that to our own home. But that's really not how it functions in the bird world. Birds are going to use that as a place to lay their eggs and raise their young. But beyond that, it's not their home base, and they don't always return to that birdhouse. It's not a permanent residence for them. So they do need other ways to shelter, and that's going to come through a variety of vegetation changes that we can make. And certainly as birds are affected by adverse conditions that they might encounter during migration or in the winter, it's beneficial for them to have a place that they can hunker down. So ways that we can achieve that would be to add some different changes to our current landscaping. The biggest one is probably adding depth to our beds. So if you look at the depth from front to back of this area of vegetation here, all that layering that's going on creates some density that allows for birds to have a place that they can forage, they can look for food, and they can also shelter in places like this. And then, so that's one dimension going from front to back, but then we also want to change it so that we have various layers to the canopy, from ground level to a sub-canopy shrub layer into a mid-canopy tree layer to all the way up into canopy. So you're creating a lot of structure and a lot of depth, both up and down and from front to back. And by doing that, we're allowing a lot more creativity in our diversity, and that will appeal immensely to a lot of our birds. You can see in a lot of these examples here that that's what I'm talking about. You can even get your backyard approved as and certified as beneficial to wildlife. There's a lot of organizations that will do that. It's a wonderful thing to do for yourself and also for the birds. So in this particular example here, this is my backyard, and I don't have a lot of shrub layers going on yet, but I'm working on that. But I do have a lot of sedges. I have a very shaded backyard, so I've introduced a lot of woodland sedges. But basically, I'm taking out all of the turf. And the less turf we have in our backyards, the more opportunities we have for more native species, and that will benefit our birds in the long run. It's going to cut down on our maintenance, and we'll be providing more of a variety of foods such as nectar or fruits or seeds. So of the common species, 19 of the 22 are insect eaters, and putting up a bird feeder can certainly satisfy a large portion of that group. But when you consider the other 125 species of birds that might show up in our backyards, we can categorize them in this way. Many of them are considered to be seed eaters, 31 species. 15 species would be consuming berries. 89 species would be consuming insects. 4 species are attracted to nectar, and 9 species are carnivores. So there's one number here that should really jump out at you, and that's the species that are attracted to or consuming insects. So insects obviously are a huge food source for many more species than these other food sources. So we need to concentrate on increasing insects in our yards if we expect to have a greater diversity of birds. There are lots of plants that we can put in our yards and shrubs and trees that will help to attract insects, in addition to actually providing food sources directly. So we have a lot of prairie plants or various plants and even other habitats that will produce seeds for birds, and they'll also attract insects. We have a lot of shrubs and trees that will produce berries or nuts. And at the same time, those trees and shrubs can be attracting insects if they are the right native species. And the same goes for nectar. We do have some species that enjoy nectar. And again, a lot of those plants that are producing the nectars will also be attracting insects. So insects are really a key feature. Some of the shrubs that would benefit birds, the viburnums are great for that. And a couple of examples would be southern arrowwood and nannyberry. Also, witch hazels are a great resource for birds. Serviceberries are great, and we have a couple examples here, Canada serviceberry and Allegheny serviceberry. But the way that these plants in these examples are situated, they don't provide any of that structure that we're talking about. So they might be a great food source, but in addition to that, we wanted to also provide shelter, so they're multi-purpose. So you'd want to work this into your landscape so that there are other vegetation types around it, and creating that depth in some of our gardens. Another good example would be elderberry. In the fall, a lot of birds go crazy over that. In the springtime, we have a lot of flowers that are going to attract insects and provide a lot of nectar. And some plants that we should be avoiding at all costs would be things like barberry and privet, honeysuckle, burning bush, Callery pear, and buckthorn, as all of those are non-native, and they all are very invasive. So I've been hinting at the fact that we need to increase diversity so that we attract more insects to our yards. As I mentioned, there's a huge percentage of our birds that are moving through that are going to be attracted to insects. So if you look at a typical yard and we have all this turf out here, that's basically a desert for most living things. There's not a lot going on in here. So we do need all those flower beds, we need all those shrub beds, and eliminate as much of our turf as we possibly can. As water becomes more and more of an issue, really it pays to get rid of all of that turf. It's much easier to maintain some of these other native species. And that diversity, again, is going to increase all the insects. So it's a win-win as far as getting away from all the turf grass. So it's just something that we have to get used to. It's a new concept. And I think it will, over time, catch on out of necessity just because of water shortages and things like that. And there's no point in adding more work to your day, having to fertilize lawns and then having to mow lawns and then water lawns and then mow lawns and then fertilize lawns. And it's a vicious cycle. So we may as well break that just for our own benefit. And as far as choosing the right plants, there's lots of places we can go on the internet. I threw an example out here of the Xerces Society. And so they're going to tell you a lot of plants that you can use that are beneficial to pollinators. And they're going to be attracting a lot of those insects that will be beneficial for the birds. And there are a couple of different regions that they have examples for, and the one I chose is the Midwest region. You could also choose Great Lakes, and then depending on where you are in the country, there are other regions as well that they have a series of examples. And so this shows you all the different plants and when they are going to be blooming. They tell you a little bit about their height, what kind of water needs they have, and things like that. So that example goes on a little further here, and then they even show you some shrubs and trees. And although not listed, oaks have been proven to be very, very beneficial for increasing the diversity of insects in your yards. One more step that you can take after you've planted all the right plants and attracted all those insects is to let your yard stay natural even through the dormant season. So leave those plant stems out there, don't rake the leaves, leave all of that on the ground for birds to forage through. And it's also a great place for overwintering insects. A lot of our insects that are going to be producing larvae, those larvae have to fall onto the ground and have a place to burrow down into in order to survive the winter. And they can't do that in turf grass, but they certainly can do it in areas like this where all the sedges and leaves are just layered up. So leave all that material and you're going to have a lot more insects in your yard that are actually favorable insects come next spring. So one other step that we have to consider is that, we do have a lot of insects around, and people are constantly trying to get rid of some of them. They're annoyed by grubs in their lawn or mosquitoes buzzing around. The problem is that a lot of the products that are used are not species specific, and so you're doing a lot more harm to all of those beneficial insects when you're trying to get rid of some mosquitoes or trying to get rid of grubs in your yard. When I look at my yard in the summertime, because I don't put any grubicide down, I might have a few holes in my lawn, which I don't really care much about, but at least I have tons of fireflies. And I look at all my neighbors' yards in the summertime and there's hardly any fireflies out there. They're all concentrated in my backyard. The last resource that we want to talk about would be providing water. And that form of water resource in your backyard can be anything. It could be a simple bird bath like these that are just static, or you can have some kind of a little fountain that's actually moving water. And the sound of that moving water is a great attractant for birds. You can even apply something like a small drip feature that would drop water into your bird bath, and that sound of the dripping is also would be a great attractant. If you can keep that going all through the winter, even better, because the birds are really looking for water sources in the wintertime. So why are we talking about doing all of these things? A study came out recently, or in the past couple of years, that indicated that since 1970, we've lost around 3 billion birds in in North America. And so that's across many, many species, affecting every species basically in North America. And we need to reverse that because we can't sustain those kinds of losses in the bird community, or we're going to lose all of our birds. And so, of course, the main culprit in all of that is us. And so we need to do some things to reverse that. And we're losing so many birds to window strikes and to cats, stray cats, pesticides used in agriculture or vehicles, and the list goes on of all the things that we've done to put obstacles in the way of birds completing their annual cycles. So we can do better than that. And in fact, we need to do better than that. Otherwise, it's just a matter of time before we're losing all of our bird species. So thanks for taking the time to view this video. Hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought, and I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.